This is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that helps you destroy and break the false icons and idols of the digital age in search of a more authentic, esoteric spirituality. On this podcast, we discuss ideology, esoterica, and everything on the fringes of mysticism, religion, and related topics. Hello, and welcome to the podcast. This episode is a solo episode. It is the last one of my solo episodes for a while. I have a couple episodes of guest episodes coming up. But this episode is going to be about a deep metaphysical question and a deep metaphysical problem that I have addressed a little bit before. I've discussed ideas about evil. Who are the most evil spirits? Why should we strive for virtue? All of these things. But yet, I have failed to ever fully address what evil is, why does it exist, and how does that relate to us as esotericists. This discussion is often given names, specifically in a Christian apologetics context, called the problem of evil. And the problem of evil refers to basically a problem that Christians run up against when they talk about religion of, well, if there is evil in this world, if there is suffering, if there is pain, if there is darkness, how can this world be created by a beautiful and loving God? Now, that question in a Christian context is a specific answer, but in the broader religious world, I still think it is something worth addressing because, it's something that we struggle with, right? Humans are fascinated by the idea of evil. And for a lot of people, thinking about evil can either catalyze them deeper into spirituality or throw them out of it and make them believe that atheism and materialism are the only possible true options. We, as a species, are deeply obsessed with the idea of evil. Pretty much every school of philosophy has had to come up with some sort of answer to why it exists. Because when you are going through something that is, truly a state of suffering, or something happens to you that can really only be explained by evil itself, right? You have to answer that question because while there is a lot of beauty in this world, there is also a lot of darkness and a lot of pain that we go through as people and that we see around us, right? Turn on the news and there's always some horrific story out there that just forces you to think about evil. So, in this episode, I'm going to be addressing the problem of evil, but from a pagan and perennialist perspective, and from my perspective. I am a polytheist, and I am a perennialist, and I am also an emanationist, and all of these labels will be relevant to how I have come to these conclusions, because I did not come to these conclusions on my own. They are ideas that, of course, I have put my thought into, but other people have discussed before as well. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, I think this conversation needs to begin with a sort of question of what is evil, because I think to figure out why it exists and the problem of it, we need to know what it is. And I think in a postmodern world, we need to address a question even before that, right? What is evil? We need to address if evil exists, because in our current ideological and philosophical world, we live in a world of relativism, of subjectivity, and where a lot of black and white statements kind of don't exist, right? That is kind of the nature of postmodernism, and we live in a postmodern world. We're no longer in modernity; we are in postmodernity. And postmodernism is an ideology about subjectivity and relativeness. Like, oh well, what is evil to me may not be evil to you, and it really gets to this idea of how can evil exist if we can't define it, and very much this denial of evil as a concept, right? Because postmodernism is always seeking things through contexts and lens, like, oh well, through X or Y lens, or you know what I'm saying. And so it's very hard to hammer down even the idea of evil in a postmodern mind. And when we look at esoteric and metaphysical traditions, they are all older, right? And if they're more modern, like they came about in the 50s or the 60s or 40s, like a lot of traditions have, they're always steeped in something before that, right? Either it's a ancient paganism or, a dharmic influence or something like that, right? They're always influenced by something ahead of it. And so metaphysics themselves from pretty much every religion clashes with this postmodern idea that evil doesn't exist or that evil is subjective or not real. Pretty much every religion posits an existence of evil. Now, what that evil is and how we address it, that is where things become a debate. But I do think we need to begin this conversation on a footing that evil is real, right? There are objective definitions for things. Beauty is an objective thing, right? We need to have a little bit of that in our brain before we proceed, because if we don't proceed with some sort of understanding like that, this whole conversation is going to be, in circles the entire time. So, evil is real, and I would like to start from that point. Now, what is it? Now, to figure out what evil is, we need to think about where it comes from, right? Where does evil emerge? And that is how we will understand it. And that gets us to a debate across religions. And that is, yes, where does evil come from? So, a lot of popular religions pose this kind of dichotomy or duality, right? You have the god that is the ultimate good, and then a spirit or entity or figure that is the ultimate evil. And these two things are clashing against each other, right? There is a metaphysical battle between these two things. It could be literal, it could be more metaphorical. And this tension is where evil is from. And so when you become religious, you pull yourself away from this darkness and towards a light, right? That is the perspective of a lot of religions in this world. But that is not the only way to deal with this question. And that is not really the pagan way of dealing with these questions. And to understand how the pagans dealt with all of this, we need to look a little further back. So, the pagan gods themselves are, if you read the myths from pretty much every culture, they are not holy, loving, and merciful gods. They are perfect. I reject the imperfection idea, but they are complex, right? They are not wholly, love and light, right? And there's some that are, but on the whole, the pagan gods are not all love and light. And for many, this is where their critique of paganism begins, right? The pagan gods are bad is a thesis that people pull from this. Like, oh, well, they are horrible and mean and they smite people and they attack each other and there's all these wars, right? A lot of people start thinking that when they read these myths and they see this severity intrinsic in a lot of the gods. And I always will say to that to turn back to the Bible, right? Most people are coming from either Christianity or Islam. And of course, if it's Islam, turn to the Quran. But turn to these books and you will see similar things to what is going on in these pagan texts, where there is a lot of severity. I mean, in the Old Testament of the Bible, God does a lot of things. Like, God literally floods the entire world except for a couple people. So, you know, um, there's darkness in that. There's no whole good. And I have yet to ever read a religious text that has, history to it and trajectory that is a, holy love and light type thing. And what this makes people wonder is, well, how can something be a god if it is not wholly loving? And this is one of the big arguments that gets people out of religion, right? They don't want to pray to, they don't want to interact with anything that is not, wholesome Chungus 5000, right? And the pagan gods are certainly not wholesome Chungus 5000. Now, there are people on the internet who got into like witch talk and paganism, especially right around 2020, kind of in a desire to get away from this sort of problem they had with Christianity that, oh, well, the god does bad things in the Old Testament, but they fail to consider that the pagan gods in their myths do some pretty intense and scary stuff. And eventually these people kind of run into theological problems because, we shouldn't go into these things expecting the gods to behave in a way that makes sense to humans, because the gods are not human. They are not. They don't act like us. They don't think like us. They are not us. And I think we have this problem where people over humanize and over personify the gods. And I think part of this comes from media, because in the West, like in our media, we will have pagan gods turned into characters in things like Marvel or horror movies or whatever, right? And the gods are literal characters in the story. Now, you don't see this much with Jesus or the Christian God. And so I think people have an easier time kind of detaching themselves from these things and understanding, oh, well, they're different. And of course, Jesus is a bit of an outlier because Jesus, according to Christian lore, is holy God and holy man. But in the other Abrahamic religions, where this doesn't hold, right, there's this big detachment between how God behaves and how people behave. And in the pagan world, this was a bit more true, right? Because people were actively following the gods. And now, like, if you go to research the gods, a lot of the information you're going to come across is from people who do not worship the gods, who do not believe in the gods, who are not polytheist. So yeah, I mean, it's there is heavy stuff. Now, why would this heavy stuff exist? And I think that's an important question. And to this, I think we need to turn to an emanationist view, right? Everything begins at one point, but it comes out. And as it comes out and expands into this universe, it has all these different layers, all these different types of meanings. And some of these meanings are wholesome, good, loving, and some of them are not. Some of them are severe and malefic and harsh. And I would like to distinguish between malefic and evil. Malefic means just dark, difficult, not necessarily positive. It's an astrological term. And evil is, of course, inherently negative and metaphysically negative, right? Evil is the ultimate negative. Evil is not something that is disapproved or risky. Like, evil is wholly evil. Now, if we believe that everything emanates from a point and that everything is connected in this kind of pantheist way, right? We have to run up against, so evil must be connected to the god, right? If everything is the god, if this animistic hyperlinked worldview is true, then this evil must come from the godhead somewhere. And now that is an answer to the problem of evil that you do not see in Abrahamic religions at all. It is foreign to the Abrahamic religions because the Abrahamic religions are so battle against. But even in a religion where you believe there is this metaphysical battle between good and evil, that evil was set there by God, right? I mean, let's think about the stories of the devil, right? Lucifer was a prideful angel who rebelled against God because God wanted him to serve man, and he thought that his role was to serve God, not man. Now, God let him become the devil, right? And so every time the devil goes after Christians, God did in the Christian religion allow that to happen. God was okay with that. And if you believe God is all powerful, God controls that and allows it to happen. And so I think a more logical theological understanding, in which, God isn't creating just an enemy to himself, which he will have to deal with later on, is the solution of, okay, so evil actually is part of the emanation. Evil is actually part of the creation. And I think to understand this, we need to look at creation itself. When you create something, you obviously engage in sexual intercourse, and then the thing is birthed a little later, right? And this could be literal or metaphorical. Now, in this process of creation, there is often death, right? If you have you been pregnant, you'll know, like, miscarriages are incredibly common. And, of course, carrying life to term is the ultimate miracle, yet that ultimate miracle is linked to death, right? There's a connection there. These things are not really dichotomous. Life and death go together. And I'll address this a little more later. When you are to purify yourself and take on a new life, you do have to metaphysically kill or let die the version of yourself that existed previously, right? To grow, you have to be willing to get rid of things that no longer serve you. And evil, if evil is part of this emanation, which it must be if you take on these positions, you have to think about, okay, so what is evil doing, right? Why would evil be created? And I think there's two answers as to why evil would be created. And the first one is of balance, right? I was talking about that death and life are linked. Creation and destruction are also linked. We understand this with ideas like the divine masculine, divine feminine, with many saying the divine masculine is order, growth, expansion. And the divine feminine is chaos. It is shaping, it is definition, it is receiving, right? It takes that endless energy and it transfixes it and transmutates it into something new, right? And if one of these sides was missing, there would be a serious problem. If nobody died, right? That means that there would be endless people being born and no one else leaving, and that would create a lot of problems for our earth, right? And death is seen as one of the scariest and most, like, evil and dark things a human can experience, right? People are horrified of death, but death serves a purpose. And so I fundamentally believe that evil is allowed to exist from the highest point of divinity and emanates down into this world, but it does so for a reason. Death does not exist just to exist, right? Because if darkness and evil exist just to exist, and they hold a real threat in this cosmic battle, right? Let's say you're going with the cosmic battle duotheism thing. Who is giving evil this power? And if evil is not given this power by God or given permission to do this by God, then evil is a separate force that is a entity and power in and of itself. And that causes a lot of really bizarre, strange things, right? Because you have to ask the question, why could this God be toppled? Because that would be the ultimate fear, right? If you have this metaphysical battle between good and evil and they're personified by these spirits, the question would be, could the evil spirits actually topple the good God? And you kind of see this paranoia in Jewish Kabbalah at certain points, where it's written as if Lilith and Samael, the two demons, hold a genuine threat to Hashem, the god of Judaism. And if that is true, then that actually negates a monotheism, because if a spirit is able to overthrow God, the highest good, the highest form of creation, then evil is so autonomous that evil in and of itself is kind of its own source of divinity. Because largely in systems, it implies that evil exists as a creation of God and is allowed to exist to serve a function. Now, what function would evil serve is a real question that people be asking. Okay, yeah. So if evil is allowed to exist and evil isn't a genuine, thing that is threatening God, like a Lilith or something, right? Why would it exist? What is the point of it? Now, evil exists in these situations is outside of that balance context. I've already addressed the balance thing. And this more relates to our growth as people. So, in our lives, we experience evil and we experience pain. We experience immense suffering. And one of the other greatest questions of philosophy and greatest questions that humans have been thinking about for so long is, how do we deal with the fact that suffering is so intertwined in our lives? What does that mean for us? What does that change? What does all of this do together? And perhaps evil and suffering is allowed to exist because we need it to exist. And a lot of traditions argue that we suffer for a reason, right? We suffer to learn things, we suffer to grow, and also a reason that is not always brought up is we suffer to face our shadow. Now, what is our shadow? So, Carl Jung, a mystic and psychologist, he is both, he is not one or the other, wrote about how every human has a shadow side, a sort of, double to themselves. And this shadow has to do with their relationship with things like darkness, suffering, and it's actually a lot of our taboo urges and desires. It's kind of the darker version of ourselves. And Carl Jung argues that it is actually impossible to kill the shadow. And many people go through their lives trying to kill their shadow, right? They want to do anything to get rid of it, to purge themselves of this darker version of themselves. And the truth is that is impossible because the shadow is part of you. So, what you do on a Jungian perspective is you learn how to integrate the shadow into yourself. And when you have integrated the shadow into yourself, you're able to have a level of control over it, right? And you can, have a good life and understand yourself and use this shadow to teach yourself things that you would not otherwise know or not otherwise understand, right? The shadow is one of our greatest teachers. And how does the shadow teach us things? When you do things like shadow work, which is a sort of metaphysical process where you explore the shadow, what do? You sink into the shadow to look into it. Maybe you do a meditation where you visualize yourself reliving your greatest trauma, a metaphysical technique that has now been used in exposure therapy. I believe it's called extended exposure therapy in psychology. Or you say invoke a chthonic spirit that you then allow to plunge you into the shadow. And the reason why you would want to be plunged into the shadow is so you can master it and bring it in, right? We cannot control what is outside of us. We cannot control our inside. And so let's think about this on a more macro scale, right? The shadow is obviously the evil version of the self. When we talk about the evil version of the entire world, right? That dark shadow side of reality. One way to deal with evil is to plunge yourself through it temporarily, to not give up to evil, right? And I think some people misconstrue this as that, right? They'll go, oh, well, I just, embrace this heavy thoughts. I embrace my urges that are, steering me in the wrong direction, because a lot of suffering and sin and whatever you want to call it is caused by us choosing the material over the spiritual. And if you are to, see this darkness, see this evil in the world and plunge yourself into it, no questions asked, no, internal struggle, there, then you are going to lose yourself and you are going to harm yourself. But you can, kind of go into this evil of the world and then use it to come out purified. If you are to purify anything about yourself or change anything about yourself metaphysically, you're going to have to realize that you cannot just manifest in or bring in new things, right? If you want your life to be better, metaphysically, you cannot just constantly ask the gods for new stuff, right? Because all those things that cause those negative problems in your life are still present within you. And until you are able to expel yourself from that, eradicate that from your being, and use the gods to actually change that about yourself, you will not reach that space that you're trying to get to, right? You will not reach your goals. And so, descending into this destructive evil force temporarily, ritualistically, in a specific context, can really do the thing that pulls that negative stuff, pulls that stuff that doesn't serve you off your body very forcefully, enabling you to become what your goals actually are. Now, there's different terms for this, and it exists in a lot of different religions. The one that I am most familiar with is the Thelemic idea of crossing the abyss. So after you have done pretty much everything in Thelema, like this is one of the last rituals you do. It's not something I have done yet. But basically, what you do is you do this thing called crossing the abyss, where you take this oath of the abyss and then you are plunged into it. And Thelemites believe that this is the ultimate test of the soul. And to become an epistemic or a truly enlightened, truly masterful spiritual person, you actually need to successfully cross the abyss. And when you cross the abyss, you plunge yourself into it. And you actually are disconnected from your holy guardian angel. You're not allowed to communicate with them. And then through your own will, you find that again and you cross it, and it teaches you almost everything, right? It teaches you so much from everyone I know who has told me about this process. Now, why on earth would you ever put yourself in the abyss, right? Logically speaking, that would not improve your life. Logically speaking, it sounds like that would make everything worse. Like, oh yeah, well, I'm just going to descend into the abyss. But no, descending into the abyss is important because while there are ways to fail this, it is kind of a test of the soul. Thelemites believe at the bottom of the abyss resides this spirit named Karanzan. And Karanzan is kind of just like a really evil entity. It's the most evil entity in Thelema. And basically, Karanzan was viewed by John Dee, the famous Enochian scryer, and he believed that Karanzan was the name of the snake in the Garden of Eden. But what happens is, if you fail to cross the abyss, you fail this test of will, you fail this test of morals, you are given to Karanzan and you are devoured metaphysically. But when you successfully do this, through that process, you have purged yourself. Because even if you make it across, Karanzan has still consumed these things that no longer serve you. And if you are going through a metaphysical hard period and you are so scared of anything malefic or difficult, you are only going to be held back, right? You have to face this stuff. It is part of the human experience, right? The hardship, the suffering, the darkness, that is all part of the human experience. And if you are not challenging that, you are not facing that, you will not grow. And so evil itself serves a purpose in our lives, right? And honestly, sometimes this severity stuff is absolutely necessary, right? I think we often in our culture, because of things like turn the other cheek becoming so, interpreted in a very specific way, right? Like, oh, well, always forgive, never hold grudges, never do any of that, that we forget that this righteous anger that does come from the same metaphysical place that, evil itself comes from actually does serve a social utility, function, and purpose, right? These things exist for a reason, and we have to interact with them for a reason as well, right? It is not just there to be there. And if you want to, become a master and, purge yourself of sin, be a righteous person, you have to know what is on you, what is attached to you, and you have to purge it away and become greater, become better, and break past it. Now, the next thing that I think this needs to address is so we understand that evil serves a social utility and that, it's not a holy duality, good evil line. But where does this leave evil spirits? Because even pagan worlds that lack this really harsh duality, right? The war between Jesus, God, and the devil, right? They still generally believe in quote unquote evil spirits, right? This could be the Lilitus, this could be demons, this could be jinn, this could be all sorts of things, it could be the Fae, right? Why do these spirits exist, right? And I'm not talking about the ones like Karanzan that really do, test you at the abyss. And I did forget to fail to mention this, but if you fail that test, like it is pretty much destruction, it's over. you go crazy, you lose it. But why do these other evil entities exist? Because obviously entities kind of have a power scale, right? There are weaker entities, there are stronger entities, and there are some that are somewhere in the middle. And entities that are evil often serve similar purposes, right? They're kind of the soldiers of the purgative quality of evil, right? And often they're actually like oriented around metaphysical punishment. And metaphysical punishment is a term that freaks people out because their mind goes straight to hell. And metaphysical punishment is not just like eternal damnation or something, right? There's layers to it, right? And often these evil spirits have specific things that they are associated with, right? And if you see a specific evil spirit, they'll be associated with something like lust or greed or whatever. And if you see them, you will know immediately that that is something that you are struggling with and something that you need to work on. And when you encounter these spirits, they are there to teach you a lesson, but you still should banish them because they still can hurt you, right? Even though evil in small doses can purify us and make us better and send us through the life, death, rebirth cycle that the entire cosmos is built around, there are certain spirits you should stay away from, right? You should, only indulge in this severity and the amount that is necessary for you and for your practice, right? You should not endlessly torture yourself or seek out punishing or be scrupulous or do anything weird, right? These spirits, they are still difficult. They're still dangerous. They should not be venerated. They should not be seen as gods. None of that should be going on, right? They are there for a reason, but they are not there to just like, you know, do this stuff, right? They have a purpose and they have a reason to exist. Doesn't mean you should go near them. And this whole conversation, I feel like I really need to, beat in home that just because evil has a purpose, just because severity has a purpose, just because like the astrological malefics have a purpose, right? Like, as you grow up, you go through all sorts of astrological transits or phases. And there's certain transits and perfection years and all these things that are known to be really challenging and hard, right? Even something as simple as like Mercury retrograde or Venus retrograde or whatever, right? These times are hard, they're difficult, and they're often great teachers, right? When we suffer, we should always be suffering for a purpose. And when really bad stuff happens in our lives, because inevitably bad stuff will happen in your life, you need to know how to transmute it. And that does not mean you should give in or give up or go, well, since evil, has a necessary purpose in the universe, I should be wholly evil, right? No, that is the wrong way of thinking. There was a cult that embodied this called the Shabbatians. The Shabbatians followed this false messiah, and they believed that you should cross every single moral boundary ever and endlessly transgress, and that's the way to enlightenment because it'll bring about some messianic figure that will save you. No, no one is coming to save you in that way, right? You need to have will and have personal strength and have the ability to overcome these things on your own and never give in to them. Yes, sometimes you need to experience these heavy things. And I mean, most suffering you go through is for a purpose, right? Even if you can't see it in the moment, in the long view, you'll see that suffering hardship you went through had a purpose. You don't give in. You try to be virtuous, right? The existence of evil and the existence of evil having a divine role in this broad story of the cosmos is not when we should give in because we are talking about the broad story of the cosmos, right? We are a small piece of the broad story of the cosmos. And there are many things that happen in the broad story of the cosmos that we obviously are faced with and have to interact with and understand. That does not mean you know what I mean, give up or give in. You should always be striving to be virtuous. You be striving to live beyond the material and not let these ideas overtake you. So, really, the truth is, the problem of evil is kind of a complicated question because when you try to answer it in this framework of evil exists, but it has nothing to do with the divine and it's antagonistic to the divine, I think that's a hard question and it's a hard sell because it's not true, right? This stuff exists for a reason, even if it is antagonistic to us, right? A lot of these severe things, especially ones that are not entirely necessary, ones that are not like crossing the abyss, right? We should just avoid and stay away from and banish and protect ourselves from, but they exist for a reason. Creation and destruction go together. Birth, life, death, it all goes together. It's all a cycle. And the beauty of it is that it follows a cycle of nature. And yeah, that's really all I have to say. This is a very short podcast because the truth is, I don't think this is as hard of a problem as many people make it out to be, right? I think that it's nuanced. And as pagans, we do follow a more naturalistic worldview, right? Pagan religion follows in the flux of nature, right? It is not adverse to human nature, right? Religion should not be adverse to human nature. It should challenge us. It should make us strive to do better, right? It should not encourage, being lazy and never changing your life and being horribly hedonistic and doing everything that hurts you. No, no religion should be encouraging that. But our religion does go in stride with what nature naturally is, right? In nature, there is birth, there is death, there is love, there is pain. All of these things, they are part of the story and they are part of what we live through. So the problem of evil, yeah, that's the answer. So if you want to support the show, you can get it on Patreon. If you join the Patreon, you get every episode a week or so early, sometimes less, sometimes more, at least 24 hours. You get a bonus episode every Neo-Pagan Sabbath. The next one is in bulk, so that will be February 1st. And if you're high enough to get your name read out. So thank you so much to Charlotte and Abka. You guys are our biggest supports and you keep the lights on. Now, I also would like to talk about my other social media. I am on Instagram, Twitter, Telegram, TikTok, Patreon, Substack. I'm really everywhere. There's nowhere you can't find me. And if you're listening to this show on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. And if you're on a podcasting platform, please give it 5 stars and write a review, unless it's a bad review, in which case, do not write a review. All right, I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much for listening. And the next one will be a little bit longer.